Well, anytime you want to get coached with public speaking. No, I mean it. I mean it because he just said he hates public speaking. So since you're going to be doing this, you might as well become comfortable with it. So, wow, here we are. Thank you for coming out tonight. We all love the Greenwich Village Society for Historical Preservation, and that's why we're here tonight. They have been doing an oral history project, and they asked to interview me last summer, and which I did, and we, Steve Zettner, my longtime collaborator, and I, have had an oral history project we've been doing for 20 years called the Lower East Side Biography Project, Stemming the Tide of Cultural Amnesia. So we're big believers. We broadcast, by the way, for people who live in Manhattan, we broadcast every Monday at 11 p.m., but you can also stream it every Monday. We have broadcast every week for the whole 20 years that we've been doing it. And thank you. The premise of it is that we interview highly self-individuated people, and then we edit me out so that you get a one-on-one with remarkable people, because, for people who are, over the age of, 47 or something, you used to meet remarkable people in New York. And that isn't as easy anymore. Not that most young people are interested because they're so remarkable. But that I wanted to re-inject that intergenerational experience, and that's what the Lower East Side Biography Project is about. So they asked me to do this, and I guess this must be, I imagine that this is something they're going to be doing regularly, with having the people who can speak live, who they're interviewing, because they interview all kinds of people. And so, of course, I thought somebody was going to interview me live, but no, I'm just going to chatter on. So I've never had a problem, I do interview myself kind of naturally. And for those of you who don't know my work, which I think many of you, my work is all based on nonfiction. So it's very journalistic, and it's all from my point of view. And I say it's my point of view, and it's what I see. So I hope someday you'll actually come and see what I do. It's very funny because I'm continually referred to as a legend, and one becomes a legend because of what they live through as well as what they do. So a lot of people are legendary and don't actually make a product, they're just outrageous creatures, and the village has long been filled with those kind of outrageous creatures, and I'm a huge fan of those kind of people. But I actually make work, theater specifically. So how do we start with can I just, with a cough, how many people are familiar with my work? Okay, so like half of you. Okay, all right, that's good, because, it's really, I'm going to be 70 this year. I'm in my 70th year. Yeah, of course, I'm in the youth of my old age. I'm not an idiot, People complain about being older. I don't know. I don't understand it, because what's the alternative? So I have been doing theater in New York for about 52 years. And when I was coming over here, I was trying to think, well, how am I going to interview myself? How am I going to do this in an hour and 10 minutes and make it, what's the point of oral history and of memoir, right? It's I'm writing my memoir right now, which is, I've tried it a few different ways, a few different times. I'm writing it because I want to know how I became who I am. And I think for any of us, there are a lot of people who are in my age group here tonight. eventually, once you get into your 60s, you start to be able to look at your own life. I mean, you can't really look at your life when you're 30 or 40 or even 50. It really takes till you're really over the hill. That's what the expression means. You have gone over the hill, meaning for one small moment at the top of the hill, you can look back and see yourself with clarity. So when I was getting ready to come over here, which, really, I do appreciate all of you coming out, because I would much rather be watching murder right now, which is really my real job. No, people don't know that. I'm a forensic expert. Yeah, I am really. And there are, people on television who need my help. I just managed to watch 30 episodes of a show called Intelligence in 2 days. So some people say, you sound depressed. And yes, depression is part of my lifestyle. So when I was coming over here and I was trying to think of how I would approach tonight, I was thinking, well, really so what do you think, Penny? What do you think, formed you? So the things that formed me were, one, being immigrant Italian, Southern Italian. I'm the first one in my family born in America, first one to speak English. Second thing that formed me was my discovery of Hollywood and of movie stars. Well, just before that, saints. First there were saints. Saints were like the first celebrities, And then after the saints came, I discovered movie magazines. And that was when I was about 9 or 10. Then I was a child criminal, which I'm not really going to go into, because I have not figured out how I'm going to really, normally, if I just talk, eventually I'll probably tell you, because I'm kind of, ruthless in that way. I'll just tell everything about myself. But then when it comes to putting it in print, that becomes another issue, because there are other people's feelings to consider, like my brothers who might kill me, right? So there's a child criminal part. I had the highest comprehension reading in my age group when I was 12 in the state of Connecticut. So I was an early reader, which is very hard being a reader in a working class immigrant peasant family, because they don't understand reading. Reading, no. Reading is basically a waste of time, unless you're doing it, for school. And the fact that school was really easy for me, and I spent most of my time reading, they really didn't care for that. When my mother was very elderly and I took care of her, and I do, of course, most people here, their parents are dead. But for those of you who still have parents, really one of the greatest things in my life that I did was take care of my mother. When I gave my mother an extraordinary death. And it is the gift that keeps giving, I'm telling you. Because even when you feel guilty, about what you put them through or whatever, my mother, when I was 40, my mother said to me, hey, I used to think it was only you. Then I found out it was everybody. That was her summation of the 60s. And so I don't know why I segued into my mother and death and dying, which is always a good topic. Okay, so then rock and roll, the discovery of rock and roll, which also happened. All of these things like crime, rock and roll, Hollywood, the saints, those 4 things all happened between 7 and 9. So I really don't play piano any better than I did when I was 7. I could play piano by ear, and I loved hearing rock and roll on the radio, because in the winter time we would have the radio on in the mornings to find out if you were going to school or not. And that's how I discovered rock and roll. And rock and roll is probably the engine of my life. And if you know my work, you know that I use a great deal of music in my work. And then I guess the other thing that would have like kind of formed my life was that when I was 13, I ran away from home. Well, I guess I should say first. When I was like 12 to 13, some girls in my town decided to start spreading rumors about me. So within 1 year, everyone in that town said they had sex with me. And it was torturous. I mean, you know, people talk about the Me Too movement. Believe me, young women today, you know, would not have lived through what it would be to have had a bad reputation in 1962 in a working class mill town in Connecticut. Okay, so this was this was the thing that I was already isolated because if you're an immigrant kid, you don't fit into your family and you don't really fit in, you know, to the new country you're in. You know, I will never be Italian, but I will also never be American. So that was the first isolation. Then the second isolation was having this extraordinary reputation that just marked my life in the most horrible way, to the point that when I was 13, I just ran away. And I ran away to the beach in Old Saybrook, Connecticut, because I had been happy there. And I stayed away for like 6 weeks. And apparently, you can't really stay away for 6 weeks when you're a 13-year-old girl without ending up in reform school. So that was where I ended up next. So there's a great book that was done by Semiotext, and you can get it pretty inexpensively. I mean, even if you pay the most that they charge, it's $20, but it's a hardcover book with 3 of my plays in it and a lot about my life. And those 3 plays are kind of the, I don't know, Steve, what do I call it? Oh yeah, thank you. That's Steve Zettner, my longtime collaborator. Steve and I have been working together. This is our 28th year, Steve? He's from Iowa, you know, so he doesn't do a lot of public speaking. So I ended up in court. I ended up in juvenile court, and the judge was a woman, and she was a Jew, and I love Jews. No, ooh, really? I know you're just doing that because you're a Jew, a self-hating Jew. Oh. Well, anyway, when I ran away, I discovered Jews. You see, my life was saved by New York Jews because I had run away with a Polish girl, with a 14-year-old Polish girl, right after this fair at St. Mary's. And this girl she immediately started begging for food, which, like, you know, I'm immigrant Italian. It's like, you know. So I escaped from her to the Jewish end of the beach because I knew she wouldn't look for me there because Jews killed Jesus. And so eventually I found all these vacationing New York Jews. And, you know, Jews are always eating. You know what I mean? So it was like no problem, you know? And I love these Jews because they had an entire cuisine without tomato sauce, which to me was like absolutely, who are these geniuses? How can you cook without tomato sauce? Like, you know, it opened up an entire new world. Bananas and sour cream for supper. Yes, yes, I understand that. Just as an aside, I did my DNA, and turns out I'm 3% European Jew. Yeah. So anyways, I ended up in juvenile court, and it was a Jewish woman judge, and she heard me speak, she asked me if I knew, if I had any questions. And I asked her what my crime was. And she said, manifesting the danger of falling into the hands of vice. Do you know what that means? And I said that I haven't done anything really bad yet, but I probably will. And she said, you're very articulate. And I said, sometimes I read the dictionary. I love words. And she said it would be a miscarriage of justice to send this girl to Long Lane Reformatory, one step from Niantic State Prison for Women. And she sent me to the Sisters of the Good Shepherd. Yes, Sacred Heart Academy for Wayward Girls. I'm not making this up. And it was there that I wrote my first play. The first day that I arrived at night, I threw a fit in the dining room because the nun kept ringing a bell saying, silence, silence. We were supposed to be in silence, silence. And I didn't know she was talking to me. And then when I went up, because I was in the new girl group, and I got my tray and got the milk and got my napkin and my silverware and went to walk by the nun who was sitting in the middle of the room at a desk with a giant crucifix behind her. And as I got closer, I saw that on her desk were 3 completely ripped open packages of cigarettes, a completely ripped open package of Kools, a completely ripped open package of Marlboros, and a completely ripped open package of Winston's. And the girl in front of me reached out and she went to pick up a cigarette. And then it was my turn. And I looked at the nun and I went to pick up a cigarette. And the nun rang the bell saying, deprived for speaking during silence. And I said, fuck you. And she rang the bell again, ding, 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 deprived for the next cigarette. And I said, I don't give a fucking goddamn fuck. And she went, ding, 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 deprived for the next week. And I said, fuck you, you asshole fucking motherfucker. And she went, ding, 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 deprived for the next 2 weeks. And then I just stopped because I thought I might want a cigarette in 2 weeks. And the next more, and then when I got up to our, I've always wanted to write a like Disney film about this reform school with these nuns, because they were all very, very young and they were discalced, which means they were cloistered nuns. So they didn't interact with the outside world. They only interacted with the girls. And so they basically lived a very cloistered life, a very 17th century kind of life, which I found extremely beautiful, as I started to live there. But when I got up there for the very first night, because I arrived at about 5:30 or 6 p.m., so I went straight to the dining room, and I hadn't even met my group mother, Mother Pauline. And Mother Pauline was from Boston, and she was a former fashion model. And there were 3 former fashion models. Yes, and they were young. They were like 21, 22, 23. And Mother Pauline said, oh, she said, I don't know what you did down there in the dining room today, but Mother Mary Mark wants to see you. And all the girls were very, very excited. And Mother Mary Mark was in charge of all entertainment. So I was supposed to go and see Mother Mark the next morning. And the next morning I went down there and I was like, what do you want? And she said, I caught your act in the dining room last night. You've got timing. You're funny. I want you to write me a play. And I was just like, I can't write a play. And she said, yes, you can. And she gave me a pack of Marlboros and sat me down at a table and told me what the subject was. These 2 sisters who were camp counselors for them, and one was getting married, and one was, surprise, 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 joining their order. And that was my first play that I wrote. So for me, the 2 years that I was incarcerated there basically did 2 things for me. One, did 3 things. It was a respite from that working class environment that I was in, and also a kind of reprieve from being with my family, because there was a darkness there that at the time I didn't understand, and it would be many, many, many years before I would know what really created that darkness. And then, of course, just being in that town, because, you know, I was considered a bad girl, but I spent all my time at the library. So, you know, bad girls with stack of library books, like the bad kids really weren't interested in you, and then the good kids were all, it was so social phobic. We've kind of returned to that, with Facebook and stuff. We're all back in high school, whether we want to be there or not. But it put me in a kind of a neutral space, 17th century, but still neutral. And I could do what I loved to do, which was read. And then it also introduced me to feminism, because these nuns, cloistered nuns, in the early 60s were very, very progressive. And, that term, sisterhood is powerful, came from the post-ecumenical council, when the nuns were trying to get out of their long habits and they wanted to be, more autonomous. It was these cloistered nuns, Benedictines, Carmelites, etc., who were really driving that idea, and that was where the first place I heard sisterhood is powerful, was with them. And of course, introduced me to writing a play. So I got out of there, and then I went home, and that didn't work out too well, because if you're like Southern Italian, immigrant Italian, you don't know. You get to either die or become a nun. I mean, there's no option. So I didn't, and it was 1966, and things were starting to happen, and I was introduced by older kids in that town to political analysis, became aware of the war, and I'm from, the town I'm from, New Britain, Connecticut, is kind of it's a working class intellectual hot spot. And we used to get high, like smoke weed and then talk about, politics, which I don't think happened in a lot of places. And eventually, I stayed home for about, I quit school almost immediately. And then and it's interesting too, because, as a child, my entire focus was going to university. I was so excited for the possibility of what I might become. And I quit school because of certain factors that were going on in my life, probably not being able to really deal with being in a boy and girl school, and there were rumors abounded, because, in a working class town in the early 60s, if you went away for 2 years, that meant you got pregnant. So there were all those kind of rumors about me, and I just couldn't kind of get settled somehow. So I quit school, and then and the thing that I was just thinking of, that I just tried to tell you, is that I remember going to look for a job, and I had absolutely no concept of how to get a job. I didn't have anyone to appeal to. I didn't have anyone, because Southern Italians really, I often say I was raised by wolves. They don't orient you to anything. You're just like another animal in the yard, so they don't really, you're not groomed in any way, and anyways, to be fair, my mother was working 60 hours a week in a sweatshop, so she didn't really have any time. And my grandparents were very, very old, for one thing, and they didn't get along, which much later I would find out what that was about. And my father was a whole other thing, because my father was from an upper middle class family. His father was the captain of the port of Savona, and he was a very unusual person in a lot of ways. And he had become a merchant marine, and at one point in 1946, or 45, somewhere in there. I haven't gotten the date yet. He jumped ship in Tallahassee. He jumped ship in Banana Boat. Steve, where was it? God, he's so useful. Steve, I think that you're I can see what's going to happen when I die. That's why I have to write the memoir, because I think that Steve's going to be this receptacle all these years. He's been my right-hand guy. We've been partners working. Oh, yeah, no. He jumped. It was like, it's a banana republic. Okay, he jumped ship in Panama. Yeah. Jumped ship in Panama and got on a banana boat, and then outside of Tallahassee, like a mile or something outside of Tallahassee, he swam to shore. And the guy who was supposed to do it with him chickened out and turned my father in, and my father ended up, my father's two brothers lived here in the village. They lived on Thompson Street. And they were like 15, 17 years older than my father. And they didn't get along with their very, very strict father, the captain of the port of Savona. So they came to America when they were very young. I think they probably ran away when they were 14 or 16 years old. And I found out later, when my Uncle John died, I went to the wake. And when I walked in and people found out that I was Vittorio Ventura's daughter, I was assailed by a group of women who were all screaming, "I knew your father. He was like a movie star. I knew your father. He was so charismatic. I knew your father. I visited him in Ellis Island. He said he was Romanian when I was there. I visited your father. He said he was French. I visited your father." And my father spoke 12 languages. And what he did apparently was he knew all these women in the village from visiting his brothers, and you're only supposed to get like one visitor. And he had all these women visiting him by pretending he was different nationalities. And my Uncle Nick told me that he was there visiting my father when the guards figured out what he was doing, and they beat him. And he was beaten by 6 guards. And when he recovered a year or 6 months later, they deported him on a boat to Italy, and on that boat was my mother, who was going back to Italy to visit her mother for the first time in 17 years. And my mother was 32 and my father was 31. My mother was unmarried. And so there's a side story, which is that my mother had grown up not in our village of Picerno, but had grown up in a place called Casa Materna, which was the first Protestant orphanage in Italy. And it was funded by American GIs. We're talking 1922. American sailors, black American sailors, funded this orphanage with Methodist churches that were in America, black Methodist churches. And so my mother had come to America when she was 17, brought by my grandfather. And my grandmother was still in Italy. And my parents met on this boat. I have all the photographs of their love affair. They were on this boat it was the fastest boat at the time, 1947, and it was a 2-week journey, and they fell in love on this boat. And, as they did in the 40s, they photographed the shit out of it. And I have all those photos. And my father went back to Savona, and my mother went to Picerno, which is the village that my family is from in the mountains of Basilicata, which is the Appalachia of Italy. You know the expression, life sucks and then you die? Yeah, they invented it, okay? No, these people had no food, okay? It colored their existence. And within 6 months, my father came to Picerno and married my mother. And then my mother secretly shipped his trunk to her friend Margaret, who lived down the street. And eventually my father came back with, my mother came back first and then my father came. But this created enormous problems with my grandfather. And by the time I was born, which was 1950, my father had decided to send for my mother's mother, right, who has been left in Italy since 1922. This is 1949. My grandfather did not appreciate this. And this created problems. And I think I'll let it rest there and get on with the rest of the story and then come back, because all families have secrets, and I spent my childhood like an anthropologist in that house. I mean, I'm sure there are people in this room who are like me, going through the drawers, trying to find out. Like, I didn't even know that I was trying to find something out, but obviously I must have been compelled in some way, knowing that there was something I needed to understand that was not on the surface. So eventually, if you're lucky, you find stuff out. And I found out a whole lot of stuff when I was 56. So in 1967, in June of 67, a carload of queens came by my house. I had started going to this gay bar when I was 15. When I'd come home, I'd get like 3 days, like after I was there for 6 months, I could go back for 1 day a month, and then 2 days a month, and then 3 days a month. And I met this guy who would change my life, Larry Biscano, who was this very charismatic gay guy in my town. And he and a guy named Aggie would drive up at night, like at 11 o'clock at night, and I'd climb out my window and get in the car, and we'd drive to a gay bar in Hartford, Connecticut. And being with gay men was definitely a deciding factor in who I would grow up to be. And I think because I was first generation, it was very easy for me to pick up gay patois. So I'd be this 15-year-old girl in a gay bar with no women. There weren't never any women in these bars. I mean, occasionally there'd be another woman. Very few lesbians went out, to bars. They had cats, they needed to be home. And I'd be like carrying on, and I just loved the environment and the music, and, I just would be, using my imagination and running my mouth as I'm doing now. And at one of these nights, another gay man turned around and said, "What the hell is she supposed to be?" And I said, "I'm a fag hag." And Larry and Aggie went, no, you're not a fag hag. No, she doesn't know what that means. You're not a fag. Fag hags are horrible. You're not like that. You're not a fag hag. And I said, yes, I'm a fag hag. This is what a fag hag is. And I think, like all young people, I was looking for an identity. And that became an identity for me, that I had a place in the world. So everything that made me wrong in the real world, in the heterosexual world, made me right in a gay bar. That I was outspoken, that I, was opinionated, that I was whimsical and lyrical and poetic, all of these things that just did not fit in a working class New England environment if you're a girl, or if you're anybody for that matter. So one night at the end of June of 1967, Aggie and Larry showed up with a car full of queens, and they said, "Pack some drag, we're going to P-Town." And I ended up in Provincetown. And I spent the summer of love in Provincetown. And then that fall, I came to New York. And while I was in P-Town, I met another gay man that would really change my life, and that was Jamie Andrews. And Jamie Andrews went on to... he was in the Playhouse of the Ridiculous, and he brought me to the Playhouse of the Ridiculous. He found me on 2nd Avenue and St. Mark's Place under the if you remember the old St. Mark's movie theater. It was raining, and I was a homeless kid in New York, and he saw me and he said, "You look horrible. You know, I think you should come and live with me." And I moved into his one-room studio apartment. And I always say to gay people now, because all this rattling on about community, you show me the 27-year-old gay man who's taking in a 17-year-old girl into their one-room studio apartment. And that's what community was. That is why there is no gay community, because gay community is obsolete. When people come out to their parents, it creates an entire different dynamic, because there was gay community because we had no one to appeal to. So people took care of each other. They took people in. They cared about people. They knew what it was like to have to leave your family because you didn't fit in. So he took me to the Playhouse of the Ridiculous, where I met John Vaccaro, and that would become another deciding factor in my life, was meeting John Vaccaro, who was an extraordinary, very, very difficult man, but incredibly brilliant, and so much of what's in contemporary culture comes from John Vaccaro. He was the first person who put a rock and roll band on stage. Hair was influenced by the Playhouse of the Ridiculous. Rado and Ragney would come and take notes at our rehearsals every night. And the thing with John, though, he was also first-generation Italian. He was Calabrese and Sicilian. And he had a lot of mental problems. He was pretty brilliant, but he was also pretty crazy and pretty cruel. And I think that my innate humility, now I don't know if you can grok that someone can be sitting here talking a mile a minute about themselves, could have humility, but there's a humility that comes from being humiliated over and over and over in your life that makes you not the center of attention in your own mind, that makes you an observer of life and damages you, and I think that I'm a testimony, if anything, to someone who was very, very damaged by life, who still managed through her curiosity to go forward and to actually transform her own life. So, people are always, going on about how young I seem. Well, that's because it's taken me so long to grow up, and it's fascinating. And I think I really do encourage all of you to, to have some compassion about your own development. I always say that by the time you're 50, you've created the life that you're living. You can't blame your family. You can't blame your background. You can't say, "Oh, I grew up poor," or my life was shit, or I never had any advantages. Because by the time you're 50, you've created your own life. And so let's see. We're pretty good. We're moving along here. We've gotten up to 1969. We're about 69. Then Andy Warhol saw me in the Playhouse of the Ridiculous in a play, and he asked Jackie Curtis. Many of you may know Jackie Curtis, the great drag queen, who really redefined drag in 1967-68, was the first person who didn't try to look real. Not that Jackie could have looked real with that linebacker body of his. But at any rate, Jackie brought me to Warhol, and Warhol wanted me to be in a film, and I was in the film Women in Revolt, and people are very fascinated about the whole Warhol thing. People have a lot of illusions about it. The whole downtown scene, pretty much from 1969 forward, is made up of people who wish that they were in Andy Warhol's factory. People who are lonely for Andy, and so it's a very interesting I haven't started writing about it, but it was an interesting period because Andy was also working class and immigrant. So, of course, I wanted to talk to him about that. And he did not want to talk about that at all. You know, the last thing he wanted to focus on was on being poor, immigrant, and working class. But I found the whole scene pretty boring because the Playhouse of the Ridiculous was ensemble theater, and it was improvisational. John, having sensed this humility in me that reminded him of his family, basically tried to break my spirit. And even though I was in awe of him, and I've always been able to contain a conflict, and I think that's one of my greatest skills, that even though I knew he was, undermining me and destroying me, I still wanted to get everything that he had to offer. He was so brilliant and so intelligent and knew everything about literature and art and had traveled all over the world. And I was just always like, there listening and taking it in. But yeah, it was pretty, his treatment of me was really devastating. He used to say, "Penny arcade, lots of tits, lits of brain." Doing the Italian accent, which was pretty weird because I've always been very intellectual, and I've never really been like a bombshell personality despite the tits, Penny Arcade, famous for breasts since 1968. But, that adage that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger is true. And for some reason, I've always had this space, like a kind of tunnel vision, that I just was going to get through it. I was going to get through it. I was going to get through it. And that's how I dealt with everything in my life. And a lot of physical violence. I was raped like 5 or 6 times as a teenager in the East Village when I was homeless. And, I never felt like a victim. I always felt like a target. And I did a show about it last year called The Girl Who Knew Too Much. And it's really interesting, like, the whole Me Too movement. I call it the failure of feminism. Like, if you're not touting the company line, you're just like thrown to the wolves or something. But Debbie Harry, her book is out, they asked me to introduce her book, and she received a lot of flack because she told a story about being raped on the Bowery at their loft, and that she was more worried about the fact that they'd stolen all the guitars. So that kind of brings us to different ways of looking at things like sex, for instance. So anybody who, not anybody, but many of us who grew up in the 60s, sex was kind of how you got to know people. You know what I mean? Like, if you were in the room with somebody, you probably would have sex with them because everybody was in this rebellion against, the Eisenhower mores, and that's why I've always knew, that rape was a crime of violence. It's not a sexual, it has very little to do with sex and has everything to do with violence and everything to do with power. But, I've kind of gotten into this kind of cul-de-sac of sexuality and rape. We'll have to all come out of there together. Okay, so in 1971, Warhol wanted me to make a film, wanted me to star in this film with him. And the other option was to go to the Playhouse of the Ridiculous to Amsterdam. And my real name is Susanna Ventura, and Ventura means adventure. And I choose adventure above everything always. And so I went with John instead of going with Warhol to London, where they did a play was done based on Andy's tapes by this guy, Tony Ingrassia. And of course, that was a real parting of the ways, because if I had gone with the Warhol thing, I would have gone back to New York, and then I would just be one other person in the downtown art scene who had a punk band in the 70s. And I didn't. I went with Vaccaro. We lasted about, 2 months before he went so berserk that everybody left the company. And then I stayed in Amsterdam, and I had a shop with a guy named Rene Hammink, who was Amsterdam's premier male hustler. And, he didn't speak English, I didn't speak Dutch, and things were really good for about 8 months. Until I learned Dutch and he spoke more English, and I realized I had nothing in common with him except that he was very beautiful. But he and I had a shop together that one of his clients had given him this building in the center of Amsterdam, and we would go to the Waterloo Plain every morning to the big flea market. And in 1971, for a quarter, you could buy the most beautiful Jugendstil and Art Nouveau, Art Deco pieces, dresses. And so we had this shop where we would buy it for 25 cents and sell it for 35 cents, And I did that until July of 71. And then Renee and I kind of fell apart. And the next thing that would really mark my life in a very important way was a girl walked into the shop who had been sitting next to me on the plane from New York when I first came to Europe, to Luxembourg. And she lives in New York. I still know her. Her name is Caroline Henry. She's a jewelry designer. And she walked into the shop, and she looked at me, and she said, "You look so sad." And I was sort of stunned because I didn't realize I was sad. And she said, "You should come and visit me in Dusseldorf." And since I spoke Dutch then, Dorf means village. So I thought that Dusseldorf was going to be this small German village. And I got there, and it was this horrible big city. Anyways, I stayed with her there for a few weeks, and then learned that my sister, Lorraine, who was 3 years younger than me, was in Amsterdam looking for me. She had just graduated from high school. And I went and got her, brought her back to Dusseldorf, and Caroline said we should all go to this place, this island called Formentera. And her mother had a hotel on this island. So I had heard the name Formentera before, because one night at Max's Kansas City, my friend Richard Hanneman, who had gone to Europe and had not come back, his girlfriend, Sandy Sawyer, ran in and said, "Richard says, come to Formentera." But being Italian, I just assumed, how there must be millions of Formenteras, because just the way the word sounds, right? So anyways, I ended up going to Formentera without Caroline Henry, and I stayed in Formentera for the next 4 years. And Formentera was this amazing island, one of the Balearic Islands, and I just felt like I belonged there. There was something intrinsic to my really deepest part of me. And I spoke the language, I spoke the dialect they spoke, because it was very similar to my Southern Italian dialect. And their dialect was a dialect of Catalan, and many, many years later I would find out why, because at one point the king of Catalonia was the Prince of Naples. So for about 400 years in southern Italy, the Spanish, had a huge presence there. And funny thing is that my grandfather used to call me La Spagnola. And he used to call me La Spagnola because of my temperament, because I get angry quickly and I get over it quickly. Italians are very kind of loose. They're not really that passionate. Spaniards are demented, Spaniard. And my real name is Susana Carmen Ventura, which is a very Spanish name too. So, we don't know epigenetically what's going on. Do you know about epigenetics? Any of you? Epigenetics it's a bona fide science where they are now seeing that we carry, as we know genetically, we carry our eye color, our weight, our height, and different dispositions, physical dispositions. But with epigenetics, they are finding that we also carry traumas, as well as joys, as well as tastes of our ancestors. And just recently, it has been discovered that the epigenetic content inside of ourselves goes back 14 generations. So, if you like licorice, it's a lot. Like if you're obsessed about licorice, somebody in your genetic chain liked licorice. If you love music, probably you're carrying that from someone who came before you. And I'm very interested in ancestors and in my ancestors. Which so let's see. Wait a minute. I got to get going. Let's just jump to 1980. Well, I lived in Formentera, I told you. Then I came back, and I ended up living in Maine. I have lived in very reclusive situations several times in my life with no running water, no electricity, etc. I did it in Spain, and then I did it in Maine. Believe me, doing it in Maine with like 6 feet of snow was like, that will make an impact on your character. And I did that for 3 years. And like going out to the outhouse, carrying water from the spring down the road, cooking on a cast iron wood stove, reading by kerosene light. Yeah. So those 3 years that I lived like that in Maine, that's about 30 years if you're living in New York. That just extended my selfdom enormously. So at any rate, I lived in Maine. I ran a theater there. Was a CETA job. If any of you remember CETA, I was the only person who was even vaguely qualified to run a theater. I made a huge success of it. I think it's very funny. I recently found out that in the library of Pittsfield, Maine, they have my name on a plaque as the first artistic director of the Pittsfield Community Theater. Yeah. That the city of Pittsfield, population 4,000, had gotten for back taxes, and it had 2 35 millimeter projectors. It was a beautiful theater that this multimillionaire had renovated this theater and then lost it for back taxes. So I created an incredible program there. One of the things I did was I brought the film Ronaldo and Clara, the Dylan film there, and made more money with it in Pittsfield, Maine, population 4,000, than they did in a lot of places in New York City and other places. Yeah, because I knew how to promote it. This was a horrible movie. It was 4 hours long. It has no plot, okay? But I promoted it in the great state of Maine, where people will travel 2 hours for culture. I promoted it as, if you ever wanted to spend 4 hours with Bob Dylan. So Bob Dylan's brother wanted to hire me to move out to Minnesota and be part of their company, but I didn't do that. Instead, I ended up coming to New York with, there's more stuff in there, but some of it's sad, like the guy I lived with died, and don't want to get into all that because I'm trying to do this in an hour, and pretty soon lights are going to blink that tell me I have 10 minutes to go. So, but I mean, honestly, can you imagine how much I can compress I mean, this is why you should come and see my work. My work is so high content. Nobody can put as much into an hour as me, okay? So, yeah, I was living with this guy named Bodan. He was an emigre. He was born in a work camp in Germany. He was Ukrainian, and he died in a canoeing accident. It was a really sad situation and a sad story that I had actually had a vision of him drowning in that lake. Yeah, I'm very psychic. We won't go there yet. Okay, so any rate, after Bodan died a couple of years later, I met somebody who was in a band that I was very fanatical about, Peter Galway. He's from New York, a great cinematic type songwriter. And I just became very involved in that band. I traveled with them. I did all kinds of work for them. And because they were like a working band, where people danced, I would go out and I would start dancing every night. So I would dance by myself, and then the entire floor would fill up because, people would be like, well, if that crazy girl can dance by herself, we should get up there. And they would. And at one point, 1979, they came to play New York. And they played at Kenny's Castaways in the West Village. Yep, we remember Kenny's Castaways as a great place. And I decided to take John, the keyboard player who was my boyfriend, to see La Mama, to see the East Village. And we ended up at La Mama, and Ellen Stewart walked in, and she saw me. And she said, "What does that mean if Penny Arcade is big in New York? What does that mean for theater?" And I didn't even think she would remember me. And she ended up inviting me to perform in La Mama's 20th anniversary, 1981, and to recreate my role in Kenneth Bernard's play Nightclub, which the Playhouse of the Ridiculous had done in 1970. And that was an extraordinary situation for all of us because that play in 1970 was about an unknown, epidemic. Like there was a plague. And in 1981, in October of 1981, we were all starting to know that something was killing gay men in New York City. So it was all kind of a deja vu for us. The thing was that John Vaccaro fired me 3 days before the play opened. And this was a very important moment in my life because John was very, very cruel to me, as I pointed out. And even when I was young, he never gave me a role. He had a huge chorus. So, there'd be like 3 or 4 main roles, and then there'd be like 25 people in glitter who were part of the chorus. And because I was a natural improviser, I would always develop a role, so people thought that I was one of the stars of the Playhouse of the Ridiculous. So here I was in 1981, and I'll give you like the inside scoop, which was there was a guy named Joe Pichette, who some people know. I know Suki knows him. He was a great actor, but he was also a great alcoholic. And he was understudying Kevin Kline in Pirates of Penzance. And he could not remember the lines in this play. In Nightclub, he had the whole, he had really 9/10 of the text was his. And so John couldn't yell at him, so John would yell at me. And John loved to humiliate people, and he would torture people, not just me, whoever he got his hands on, but he would do it to me a lot. And I had been reading, when I lived in Maine, I of course, I've always done a lot of reading, but in reading Anneliese Nin's diaries, I was kind of embarrassed to realize that I never wanted to go into therapy because I was afraid it would get rid of my individuality, that it would get rid of what made me interesting. And when I was reading her diaries, I found out that everyone who she knew, Ernest Hemingway and all of those famous people that she was involved with in Paris, none of them would go into psychoanalysis because they were afraid of losing what made them artists. And I was so embarrassed that I was like so typical, that when I came back to New York, I went into analysis with Mrs. Williams, my analysand. And I would tell Mrs. Williams what was going on with Vaccaro and stuff, and she'd say, "Miss Ventura, how can you allow yourself to be treated this way?" And it didn't even occur to me at that time, I was 31, it didn't even occur to me that I shouldn't be treated badly. Not that I even thought about it as I was being treated badly. I had that kind of soldiering on thing that no matter what, I knew what I was interested in, I knew what I was going for, and I would just like let it pound on me, but not really enter into me. And so one day Vaccaro was ranting at me, and I just said, "John, I really want to do this show. I really want to show New York what the Playhouse of the Ridiculous is. I really want you to direct me, but the way that you're treating me makes me feel angry." And he said, "It's because you're stupid." And then I knew what I was supposed to do. I was supposed to kneel at his side and then eventually put my hand on his leg and go, "I'm sorry, John." And then he would have me rehearse again. And I couldn't do it. And a little voice in my head, and I've only heard voices in my head like 3 or 4 times. A little voice said, "If you do that, you will never do anything important in your life." So finally, after like 4 hours, I said, "John, if you're not going to use me tonight, is it okay if I go home? Because I have to model tomorrow." I was working as an artist model, and like for $2.75 an hour, working like 12 hours a day and then going to rehearsal. And I left. And the next morning, I called John. But before I called him, John Albano, who some people know, he died of AIDS. He was a wonderful person. He was my age. He called me up and he said, he goes, "Do you want me to call John for you?" And I said, "No, I have to do this myself." And he goes, "I only have one question." I said, "What's that?" He said, "Why did you take it for so long? Why now?" And I didn't have an answer. So I called John and I said, "Hi, this is Penny." And I knew the first person who spoke was lost. And I didn't say anything, and I didn't say anything, and I didn't say anything. And John didn't say anything, and John didn't say anything. And then John said, "You're fired." And I said, "Are you sure?" And he said, "Yes." And that night I went to the Ritz, where they were doing, what is that show? It was a Tom Ian play, The White Whore and the Bit Player. Suki, is that the name of it? Anybody know? Well, anyways, yeah, it was a Tom Ian. Tom Ian wrote Dreamgirls, but he wrote all these plays for La Mama. And Jackie Curtis saw me and took me, into the VIP lounge, and Iggy Pop was there and all these people. And I said, "John Vaccaro fired me today." And Jackie said, "Fantastic. Who knows what you'll accomplish now?" And like announced it to the room. And I was like, "No, it's like embarrassing." And then I saw Taylor Mead, and I sort of very, quietly confessed to Taylor, "John Vaccaro fired me today." "Fantastic. Now you're really going to accomplish stuff." And I was like, what are these people talking about? And then I went to my therapy, and I said to Mrs. Williams, I told her the whole story, and I said, "He fired me." And she said, "Oh, dear, Miss Ventura, it doesn't seem as if your therapy is doing you any good. I mean, you're fired?" And I said, "Yeah, I had to stand up for myself." And then I realized what she just did to me. And, I didn't have many reviews then. I'd only been reviewed a couple of times in the 60s. So when I found out that John was telling everybody, I wish Penny Arcade was dead. And it was very painful, until one day I went, gee, why does he wish I was dead? Maybe I'm talented. But I had to work my way to that, okay? And so then when I made my poster for my first show, this happened in 1981, and my first show was in 1985. I did small things, improvisational stuff. I was in, that was a blink. Yeah, I saw that. Okay, great. We're getting to the end run here. This is perfect. So what happened was that in 1981, I was in Hibiscus's last play. Hibiscus was a village person, from the Cockettes. And I used to improvise to amuse Jackie Curtis, who was the star of the show, when we had breaks. And one day, Hibiscus came to me and he said, what you're improvising is so much better than what I wrote. Would you consider doing that in the play? And I told Jackie, and Jackie said, ask him for a writing credit. And I said, no, I can't ask him for a writing credit. Maybe he won't let me do it. And Jackie said, do it. And so I called him up and I said, hi, yeah, I would love to do that. I would like a writing credit. I had it written down on a piece of paper. I would like a writing credit. And he said, yeah, no problem. So that was the first thing that I wrote that was in a play. And then in 84, I realized that just talking to people like I'm talking to you, that I could make theater out of this, that I could tell my stories and what I understood. And so I made a poster, and I had my two little quotes on it, and then I put a third quote. I wish Penny Arcade was dead. John Vaccaro. So that was 1985, and so for the past 38 years, I have made my own work and became a poet and an essayist. We lost John Giorno, the great John Giorno, the poet, October 11th, and my piece on John Giorno is going to be in the Poetry Project newsletter, and it's probably already online, so you can read that if you like. And there's lots of stuff that my Facebook page is open. I run it kind of like a journal or like a magazine. I like to promote a lot of other artists. You can't come and see me every night. And so thank you. You've been a really wonderful audience. Thank you so much.